In the space industry, it's quite common that the customer, the end customer, decides on the conditions to use. So they contract with a prime contractor or even more prime contractors, is quite common as well. And they push on the conditions down the whole contract tree. And this contract tree can be incredibly complex because there's so many parties involved. There can be even hundreds of parties involved in any one project. And these parties, they can be your customer, but they can be the supplier at the same time as well. So there you see the whole complexity of this industry actually that comes back in the contracting tree.
What we see as well is what makes it unique is that the technology is usually super complex and that there's a lot of development in the projects and that also many parties are involved in this process. So that means many interfaces, but also system alignment. So what happens quite a lot is that we have to renegotiate in the course of the program, and we have to anticipate on that as well in the contracting process already, because we know it will come.
What we see with institutional customers, for example, is that it's a bit more rigid. The whole contracting is a bit more rigid. There's less room for negotiations. What you see is that there's more forms to fill, more paperwork, all to get to a contract. Yeah, the pragmatism is less with institutional customers.
To add to the government, it also makes it sometimes harder to negotiate. So it's more difficult to enter into a balanced contract because there's less pragmatism and less flexibility actually. On the other hand, government can also be very predictable. So you know what kind of negotiation you're entering into. And sometimes also reliable. For the commercial part, what we see is that the range of customers is extremely diverse. So you have very unexperienced customer until super experienced and also very powerful customer with a lot of knowledge of the market and the industry. In that kind of negotiations, it's also sometimes easier to get to a balanced contract depending on the customer, but it requires a lot of flexibility because you don't know what kind of customer you're starting with and you really have to adapt to that as well, adapt your approach. So yeah, super diverse range. They can be very close together, the institutional and the commercial customer, and it can be really far apart.
If I take, for example, the ESA GCC, the conditions for ESA contracts, if you look, for example, at the liability clause to take one of them, well, it's incredibly complex to read it already and to understand what's actually in the clause. And it spans a couple of pages for sure, with all the exceptions in it and all the language that is there. Well, if you look at commercial contracts, they're more like commercial contracts in, for example, the IT industry or in other tech contracts. And it's slimmer, it's more pragmatic, and it's easier to understand as well.
Recently, also in the very high volume commercial contracts, is that there's a lot of flexibility built into the contract. So adjusting volumes, for example, and that is something we see less in institutional contracts. So there's actually the commercial parties often put more thought into what do we actually need in this kind of a contract and how do we practically deal with this contract, and then they build in clauses for that, whereas an institutional contract is usually quite standard. It has all the boilerplate clauses, but then there's also less flexibility to adapt again to the kind of project you are actually working on. There's no one size fits all for approaching risk, because like we just said, we have all these different kind of customer, different type of projects as well. So what we do for handling the risk in contracting and reaching agreement is that we really look at the full picture. So you look at the technological side, you look at the managerial schedule implications, but also the terms and conditions, of course, and look at it as a whole. And even more than that, so we look around it. Who are the key players here? What could happen in this kind of project? And then we make a list of the top risk and then find approaches that go with that risk. And we try to find multiple solutions, of course, because you're going to enter into a negotiation and you try to find the solution that works best, but also have some backups. So for some, we do it together with the customer. We try to find a joint approach. We really put the risk on the table and discuss. And for others, you try to find more smart solutions in your contract without necessarily involving the customer completely. So it really depends on the case, but you try to make a full picture of the risks and then see which ones you want to address in the process. And of course, it's space, so there's an inherent risk. Everything needs to work at the end of the project. It cannot go wrong, but it also means that a lot of the parties are, of course, not very willing to take on that risk themselves. And that is usually the puzzle. You know the risk is there, but how do you agree to it together?
A bit of risk management also is in the policies we have. We have some contract policies that describe how we deal with contractual risks or risks in contracts. And I think that also helps in understanding the risk in the contracts and also giving it a bit of a framework for further discussion within the teams to look at the risks that Emma just mentioned. A policy that we developed is, for example, our contracting policy is one I really like, because it helps you in reviewing contracts as well. It can act as a checklist, but it also gives you the boundaries in which to operate in negotiating a contract. And I think that's why it's really helpful. I would always say hire a lawyer for this because it is very specialized work in the end. Secondly, what you need to do is be aware of contracts, of how these contracts are structured as well, but also the topics that always need to be in a contract for your protection as well. And that's the way you view at these policies that protect you. But you also want to find a certain balance with the interests of the other parties. So look at your own risks, your own interests, and then apply them to a policy like that. That's just very generic. In more detail, you would have to go through each topic and look at how you want to define these topics. What we see again is that the field, the whole market is quite complex. And the whole contracting structures are complex as well. You have this phenomenon where the end customer decides on the conditions to use, and that makes for a very specific environment in which to operate. And the way we see it is that we are part of an ecosystem. We're not independent in that sense. In space, normally you need more parties in order to get to a certain result. So that means that you have to cooperate with many parties, and many of these parties for us are SMEs as well, small and medium enterprises. And if we would apply the conditions we normally see in the market, these parties simply don't understand because they normally don't have a lawyer employed. So they would have to hire outside counsel. They don't do that. They just sign the contract they get in front of them. And then from there, the trouble starts already, because if you get into a conflict, finally they see what is in the contract, not happy with that, and a conflict arises. So we thought, how can we change that whole situation? And what we discovered was by simplifying, visualizing contracts, people understand these contracts better. And that's exactly what we wanted to do. So that's why we started this whole journey of simplification and visualization, just to make the contract more accessible to everyone. Actually, it's not only smaller parties like startups, SMEs, but also other parties. We just want people to be able to understand what is in there. Yeah, and there's some really interesting things happening there when you do that. One of them is, for example, when we started with our terms and conditions that we had simplified and visualized, we saw that there were more negotiations about our conditions when we started applying these conditions. And in first instance, we were quite amazed by that because we thought, we made it simpler, we made it easy to understand. How come that we have more negotiations? And then we realized, oh, that's because people understand finally what they are signing. So they get back to that and starting to negotiate. So you see there already that understanding is higher. And another thing that we discovered is that if you get into a conflict with a party, with a supplier, for example, the discussion isn't about the contract language anymore. Normally, you would have to talk about interpretation of certain clauses, etc. Nowadays, with these contracts, we see that the conflict is about the conflict and not about how it's written down entirely and about the interpretation of clauses, because the clauses are quite clear. The first thing that pops into mind is to look at the language that you use. So it's very easy as lawyers to use these legalese, right, as they call it, like legal language, etc., etc. But that's not the way we talk with each other. That's not the way people understand language. So try to simplify your language. You can make these whole long sentences with all kinds of sub-clauses in it, etc., etc. That doesn't help in understanding. Split it up, make shorter sentences, make active sentences as well, because lawyers are very good in making passive sentences. So use active language. Apart from that, what we did is use certain icons in our contract to indicate where there are obligations to agree, obligations to document, obligations to inform, for example. And we indicated them with certain icons in the text. So that makes it easier already. And we, at the end of our general terms and conditions, there's a guide to operating the terms and conditions, as we call it, that summarizes the obligations the other party has, whether it's a customer or a supplier. And that way it's easier to operate the agreement as well. I think these are some, and we added some timelines. I shouldn't forget to mention that. Because normally you like, for example, you have acceptance, then you can invoice, then there's a payment term, and we put that in a timeline to show very visually how these relate to each other and how these terms relate to each other. And that helps very much in understanding what's going on there.
Maybe adding to that, what we also sometimes see is then that there's no comments in the contract itself. But then to the timeline, there's a remark like, this is not what we agreed. So that clarifies quite a lot, actually, that people are maybe better looking at pictures at times than looking at the text. And another thing, adding to Jerry's recommendations, is also to really think, like, how did I structure my contract? Does this make sense? If you go through the process of the project itself, is this how you would read the contract? We're also still learning a lot in that sense, because if we look at our earlier versions of our terms and conditions, we're also improving on that end. And to check for redundant wording or clauses. So not just to simplify, but also check, is it necessary to use the word any and all constantly, for example? Things like that are also helpful.
Well, one of the things we encounter a lot is IP arrangements. Obviously, we're a high-tech industry. And what you often see is that people use very standardized IP clause language, but that's not often serving your best interest. So what would be better is to look at how do I want to arrange for IP, also considering the future. What IP do I need in the future? What can I let go? And how to do that? And it means that you need to have a very good sight on your strategy, your interests you have, in order to get to an understanding there. So the thing we did is we developed a framework, a collaboration framework, and a whole methodology to get to a collaboration. We designed workshops to get to an understanding of both parties' interests, and also there are ways in there of how to make a split in IP, who gets what and for what markets, etc., etc. There's a whole thing. There's a whole lot you can do there, and based on that, you get to a better IP arrangement that serves both parties in the long run.
The second major challenge that we see, especially recently, also a trend actually in space industry. There's more and more very high volume projects. So for constellations, for example, while there's still quite a technological risk in those projects. And we touched upon this in the risk question as well. Addressing that risk that is next to IP a very big challenge we see recently in all of our negotiations. So the technology still needs to mature, still the product is sold and the project is sold, and you need to deal with that risk. And finding the approach for that is another main challenge that we have. Again, it depends on the case. How can we solve this? At times we agree to things like a joint management reserve or a timeline or an approach. So what if something goes wrong? How do we then address it? Maybe a joint backup scenario that we develop together with the customer. So there's multiple solutions. You just have to be very open to find the solution and to discuss openly with your customer, like, okay, this is the big risk we see here. These are the conditions under which we can enter into this contract, and then explore all the possibilities and solutions to that. And then try not to solve it in text is what I usually also try to bring across. We're not negotiating contract language. We're negotiating a solution. And once we have that solution, we see how we can transfer that to the contract.
I so often see that lawyers are negotiating language, right? This clause, they're shifting around commas and words and then think that it will happen. And in the end, what appears is that behind it, there's a whole discussion that's not being addressed. So first have that discussion, and then you can draft the language. And it's easy to draft the language even. But start with the true discussion that is there.
We see more and more startups on the one hand, and on the other hand, also more big or a few big players who also enter into many large volume contracts. So that's the two ends of it. Another trend that we see is the focus on the strategic independence, given all the geopolitical developments of these days. There's a trend to go back to more independence for nations or regions, also affecting how much money is spent on space by government.
I'm quite happy with this question because it gives me the opportunity to slip in Katy Perry in this interview. A couple of weeks ago, we saw Katy Perry going into space and becoming an astronaut, as she said herself. Of course, there's some controversy about that, but I mean, I think it's very indicative for the commercialization of the space industry, where like when I started 15 years ago in the space industry, it was mainly institutional and there were a couple of commercial players, but not that many. And now we see a huge shift there in many more commercial players. Like Emma already said, the startups that are there, etc., etc. So there's a lot of commercialization going on. And another thing that we see is these missions to the moon and to Mars. They shape the whole landscape as well. There's a lot of investments into going there. It changes the industry as well.
We also see that a change in administration can also make a huge difference there. So it can go from moon to Mars all of a sudden. And that also affects the projects and the agreements we're working on. again something to consider when negotiating, that things may change. So you may enter into something for the long run, and midway there may be a change in policy that actually ends this project immediately. You have to anticipate on that as well.
Of course, you need to have a proper understanding of the whole legal framework, right? That's a basic, actually. I always say that's your starting number in the race. That's where it actually begins. But what we see that's getting more important now for people to understand is the whole use of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is reshaping our whole profession. It's happening as we speak, of course. But I think the way we approach our work will change tremendously. There's a lot of work that we now do on a daily basis that even is a large part of our work that will be taken over by AI. And that means that we need to use AI as a companion or as a support function or something, but it's something that you need to learn to work with. And the earlier you start with that, the better, I think. Another thing, of course, obviously, I would say that is learn how to simplify and to visualize, because it's something that really helps you in your future.
For me, understanding the business is a very big one. I'd advise anyone in whatever industry you work in to get a very good understanding of the business, talk to people, get a view on how it works, because you can have all the legal knowledge in the world. But if you want to agree to a good deal, you need to understand how this business works and to apply those principles in your negotiation, also of contract terms. So that's one big one. And another one, and that is linked to a trend that we see, is that it is good to have broad knowledge of all the legal topics, but to have a specialism as well, especially if you work in one of the bigger entities. There's a lot of specialization. So it's good to have one specialism, to be part of an expert group or whatever, to really have an added value for the business as well. I think most of the people, if you look at our department, next to being a contracts officer or a legal counsel like Yeti, they have one specialism or one or two where they can really add value to the department and to the company.
When I started my career many years ago, it was common to have like legal counsel, one counsel, a lawyer that knew a lot about many different subjects and then was able to do that all by himself or herself. Nowadays, what you see is that the whole legal world has become very complex as well. And you see that topics get more and more complex and you need more and more specialization there. So the old function of a legal counsel from when I started is not really possible nowadays anymore. Not one person can have all this knowledge by himself. So, like Emma rightly said, you need like a broad view for sure in whatever function you are, but also to have this specialization in order to get further. You see it in the job market as well. If you look at the job market currently, there's many jobs that require a specialization. There's not so much demand for broad legal counsels as they used to exist anymore.